What if I were to tell you that this government and previous governments, and in fact for decades, have been giving away your money for nothing, just giving it away for whatever they like, unconditionally, just handing your money over? Because that's exactly what's happening. But if that shocks you and that upsets you, that will not be the most shocking and upsetting thing of this video, because there is a vicious little circle. When you go down a bit of a rabbit hole and you look at these things and you do a bit of research and you find out what on the face of it appears to be going on, you think to yourself, this really is bad. So allow me to show you what I've been looking at. I promised you on my wealth channel here, I will start looking at certain things with government spending, where the money's going, and try to uncover some of these things. Now, I feel that I've only just scratched the surface on this because I've never really researched this before. I've always been tied up in all kinds of other study, but here we go. Let's take a look at this one. So first of all, it's not clickbait and it's not just an empty hook to get you to watch the video. It's true. They are literally giving away your cash unconditionally. It says as much here. The program will provide unconditional cash transfers targeted at every individual in climate vulnerable community in order to build resilience to climate shocks. Now, hidden within that is the real reason I think that they are in so much trouble, and the little quirks and details that keep people in receipt of these funds dependent on their ongoing situation that apparently hasn't really changed in decades. Now, for this particular program, we're talking about Malawi in the eastern area of Africa. You've probably heard of Malawi. You may or may not know much about Malawi, but what you do know now is that there's this program set up, which in the last couple of years alone has sent £4.5 million for unconditional cash transfers. As I say, there's a bit of a rabbit hole, so bear with me. But this summary sheet over here details what they're sending it for, broadly speaking, but also the fact that it is an unconditional cash transfer of £433 per adult for the 8,800 adults there over the course of 2 years. And it says 70% of them live on less than $2.15 a day. And that hasn't significantly changed over the last decade. The lack of household capital remains a binding constraint. The UK intends to spend at least £1.5 billion on climate finance for adaptation in helping developed countries build their climate resilience. Climate resilience is another phrase being bandied around. Now, this does say that there is a large amount of evidence on the effectiveness and the efficacy of cash transfers. So the options appraisal first considers the kind of transfer most likely to be successful at building long-term resilience. So they are going to send unconditional large lump sum cash transfers targeted at every individual, targeted at every household, and unconditional small monthly cash transfers targeted at the poorest households. And finally, conditional cash transfers requiring an activity to be completed, such as going to school, etc., so to reward behaviour. Now, when I was reading these documents, I ended up going off on a bit of a tangent and then down a bit of a rabbit hole. Because if you take a look at this bit here, it says in 2024, southern districts of Malawi recorded very low rainfall due to the impact of the El Nino, causing a significant reduction in crop production. Reduced income for farmers and above average food prices. Many households not yet recovered from the impacts of the tropical cyclone Freddy in 2023, but will likely face a difficult lean season, etc., etc. So they're talking about a difficulty with crops because of the climate change, etc. So this money sent to them is to help with that, to help them produce crops. Now, obviously, across Africa, there's a number of different crops produced and exported, but in Malawi, the predominant crop they produce is raw tobacco leaves, as in unprocessed, just plain tobacco leaves that then get bought up by tobacco companies along the supply chain that ultimately end up being sold by the big companies at vastly inflated prices when they finish production. But here's where we go down the rabbit hole. We're not going to go down too deeply today. It's just to give you an idea, to give you a little bit more food for thought. But that reading and digging led me to this website here, exposedtobacco.org. Now, for legal reasons, I'm not making statements of fact here. I'm not saying that any company has or has not done anything, whether they should do or not, but this is what they're reporting here. And they had an interesting article on Malawi and its crop production and that of tobacco. And interestingly, it said here that there were efforts to keep farmers dependent, i.e. dependent on the supply chain. Now, bearing in mind from the previous document here, it said that many of them are living on just $2 or so a day, and presumably they don't have a significant income from the crop production, even though the majority of it is produced with crops, and they are struggling with climate change, etc., which is how we got here the cash injections from the UK to try and tackle climate change. But what's worse, according to this report, is that many of these loans they're forced to take are from the companies that are buying the tobacco. So this says, quoted here from a farmer in Machinji, he says, "We are forced to take the inputs on loan from the tobacco leaf buying company, i.e. the seeds and all of the other stuff to grow the crops that don't really sell. They are forced to take this loan from that company." He says they are supposed to give us a choice to take the loan or not, but it's mandatory. And this gets us into unwanted debts. So in other words, this report says that this farmer is telling them that they are forced by the companies that are buying the tobacco to take a loan from them to buy the seeds and the fertilizer and everything else to grow crops that they can't sell. So they are dependent on the tobacco that they sell to the company they've taken the loan from, thus creating this cycle of dependence. And obviously, they are only getting the bottom end of the supply chain value for the crops that they're producing. And so they are in this vicious cycle of providing these crops to companies that are in effect forcing them to stay dependent on what they sell. Ironic, given the subject matter of the crops they're producing. And thus we end up in a situation where we have our Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office providing this funding to the tune of £4.5 million on this one project alone. Some cursory research suggests that the money sent in this fashion or some fashion like it over the last decade or two is in the billions. And so one really has to question then, is this really tackling the problem, the underlying problem of the dependence on growing a certain crop because certain companies buy it, and that is pretty much all they are doing in that area. It is 60-70% odd of the whole production of what they're doing in that area. And since my channel here is about creating wealth, this really is an example of probably the most difficult situation an area could possibly be in. This is the one thing that they can do in that area, and they are so dependent on to whom they sell those crops. And reportedly, by this website, by the farmers they say that they've spoken to, they say they are in effect forced by the companies buying one crop to take loans from them, which keeps them in debt, which keeps them dependent on producing that crop, and the cycle starts all over again. And so respectfully, whilst this project and this funding here appears to have good intentions at heart, one really has to question whether or not it's going to solve the problem. So probably not the twist in the tail that you're expecting from this video from the outset, but let me know what you think in the comments, because this really, insofar as a tale of wealth goes, is a pretty grim one. Let me know what you think in the comments, and do subscribe to the channel, and as always, thank you for watching.